We'll go ahead and get started. So we will be talking tonight about the evolution of seals, sea lions, and walruses. And I love this quote by Victor Sheffer about these animals. So they are also known as pinnipeds. The whole group is known as pinnipeds, which means feather foot, sort of referring to the shape of their flippers. And they are also sort of colloquially known as seals. So this quote says, "From the study of seals, those queer amphibious creatures living at the interface of land and sea, we gain new respect for the far limit possibilities of mammalian adaptation." And I love this quote because it really sums up to me what is just really, really fascinating about these animals. And I am excited to share some of that with y'all tonight. So during our talk, we'll start off by just a quick introduction to who I am and how I ended up studying these animals and their fossils. And then we will go into an introduction to modern seals, sea lions, and walruses, kind of get an idea about their ecology, where they live. And then we will start focusing in on the paleontology side of this story and talking about where these animals came from, what their evolutionary history looks like. And then we'll focus in on my dissertation research into these fascinating critters. So we'll talk about that new fossil pinniped that August mentioned, as well as looking at locomotor evolution and using the fossil record to predict their reaction to climate change. And I just wanted to, I've also got a lot of really cute pictures of pinnipeds in here because they are just really fantastically adorable animals. So this is a Antarctic fur seal baby from South Georgia Island, and they're like one of my favorite animals. I did not even know that these cute critters existed until I started sort of specifically studying them. So I've just sort of come to love them more and more. So I grew up going to the zoo quite a lot. My mom would often take me and my little brother early summer mornings to go to the zoo, and we would get up early, especially early, to make it to the sea lion feeding in the morning. And I will just always remember like looking up into that enclosure and seeing the zookeepers throwing the fish out to the sea lions and how they would leap out of the water and all of the barking that they would do, and like that very intense sea lion smell, which if you've ever been to the sea lion caves out on the coast, you definitely know what I'm talking about. So I've always loved animals. I always ask people, like, when I meet them, what's your favorite animal? And I didn't ever even realize like that's sort of a strange question that not everyone thinks about all the time until like the last year. But pinnipeds have sort of always had just a special place in my heart from this like early memory. But I didn't realize that I wanted to study them until quite a bit later. So in 2016, when I was smack dab in the middle of getting my earth science degree, I visited the University of Oregon as I was looking for graduate schools. And one of the old grad students, Nick Famoso, who works out at John Day Fossil Beds now, took me down into the fossil vault at the university and was opening drawers and showing me mastodon teeth and dog skulls and all of this cool stuff. And then we got to the back and he opens his cabinet and he said, "Oh, these are the pinniped fossils. No one here works on those." And I didn't even know what a pinniped was. It's like, what is a pinniped? And he said, "Oh, like, you know, seals and sea lions and walruses." And I kind of thought, I could work on those. That would be really cool. And I have a lot of reasons for sort of loving these animals. I think they're really fascinating because they, for a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is just because they are just stinking adorable. So again, I just want to make sure that sort of hit on that point because I really, really do. I love them. They're so cute. So in modern pinnipeds, we have three currently living families. So we have the true seals or Phocidae, the eared seals or Otariidae, which this consists of both sea lions and fur seals. So they're the ones that have the external ears, as well as walruses. And one of the things that really sets this group of animals apart is that unlike other marine mammals like whales and manatees, seals and sea lions and walruses rely on both the land and the sea for their life cycle, which makes them amphibious. So like a frog has different life stages that take place in the water and on the land. Pinnipeds are sort of similar in that they have to have access to both the water and the land in order to survive. So whales and sirenians like manatees and dugongs have fully transitioned into the marine realm. They never come out on land. And even sea otters are actually, even though they don't look quite as, they're not quite as morphologically adapted to the ocean as pinnipeds, they can actually spend longer amounts of time at sea and rely less on the land than pinnipeds. So it's kind of they're kind of unusual group in that they have to both be able to move around on land and in the water. So these two very different media. So they're kind of uniquely situated in this sort of liminal space between the terrestrial realm and the marine realm. So obviously, we all know walruses. They are these very large pinnipeds that live in the Arctic Circle. They're particularly known for their big giant tusks and just for being like rather rotund. And they live all around the Arctic Circle. And there's only one living species of walrus today, which will become relevant in a little bit. And then we also have our eared seals. So that's sea lions and fur seals. And they're kind of interesting because we've got 15 different species of these, but they're all relatively similar looking. So they all most of they're very sexually dimorphic. So the males are really big and they have usually have this big like dome thing on their heads. Skulls are very domed. And they all sort of have this very like basic sea lion shape. And then we have our true seals, which are sort of the most morphologically diverse of all of these groups. So you've got walruses that they're in our modern world. We only have one species of walrus. We have 15 species of eared seals that all look pretty similar. But in our true seals, they just have a huge amount of morphological diversity. So here on the left, you see a male and female northern elephant seal. I always think that these look kind of like Gonzo from the Muppets. And they have a huge amount of sexual dimorphism. The males are several tons. They weigh several tons, and the females are much smaller. But then you have some seals that are not very sexually dimorphic. So there in the middle, you see a leopard seal. This photo was taken by National Geographic photographer Paul Nicklin, and this leopard seal was like swimming around in the water with him and kept bringing him this dead penguin, trying to teach this what the leopard seal must have thought of as a very dumb seal, trying to teach him how to fish for these penguins. And they're actually, the males and females are pretty similar in shape and size. And then you have some other weirdos like the bearded seal here on the right. I really love the bearded seals for their very fabulous whiskers. And then you even have some really strange versions of true seals like the hooded seal. that has this like extremely sort of strange protuberance on its nose. And on one side of its nostril, it has this big membrane that it can blow out. And they will sort of actually sort of bounce these balls around on their face, these big blown up sort of sacs. And this is a mating display, which they just look so strange. And one of the things that makes one of the other big differences that you see between these groups is that your eared seals, your otarids, they are able to walk around on land using all four limbs. So they can, so they're really great swimmers. But they also are able to walk on land. So which often sometimes can lead to sea lions in, sort of showing up in really odd places, like the middle of Walmart parking lots or on people's front doors, 5 miles from the ocean, because sometimes they just get a hankering for going back to land and just head inland, which can lead to some really interesting encounters between humans and wildlife. But your true seals have lost the ability to walk on all four limbs. So their hind limbs are stuck in a permanently backwards position to sort of stabilize them, because they are hind limb swimmers. They use their hind limbs to propel themselves in the water. But this means that they really aren't able to walk on land. I kind of call what they do flumphing, which is a very technical term. But as you can see, this hooded seal here is kind of all stretched out, and they just sort of undulate, like a little bit like a caterpillar. And this is just a very like charming mode of locomotion when you see them, especially on land, but they can actually move pretty quickly when they're on ice. So true seals, they're sort of fairly global in their distribution. But there are sort of concentrations of species at both poles. So there are a large number that rely heavily on ice for their life cycle, for giving birth, for resting, and for moving around. It's kind of shocking to me how fast these guys can get going when they are on ice. So thinking about the ecology of these different critters, so most seals and sea lions are pretty generalist in their diets. So they're eating a lot of fish, a lot of cephalopods like this octopus that you see the sea lion here in the middle getting at. And you can also see in this picture the difference in the ear structure. So sea lions have this external ear. They've got this cute little flap. But then the true seals, they just have like a little hole on the side of their ear and this is kind of making them more streamlined in the water. And so thinking again about the diet of these critters. So most of the seals and sea lions are generalist feeders, but you do have a few notable exceptions. So crab eater seals, despite their name, crab eater, they don't eat crabs. They actually eat krill. And they feed kind of similarly to baleen whales in that they will close their mouth around a sort of a little cloud of krill. And they have these very sieve-like interlocking teeth they can force the water out through without losing the krill. And so they're kind of this weird, almost whale-like sort of adaptation that you see again in the very morphologically diverse true seals. And then you have walruses, which are just very, very strange. They have these very boxy skulls. They've got these big giant tusks, and they are not generalist feeders. They are almost exclusively molluscivores or mollusk eaters. So they're eating clams and shellfish, and essentially the way that they eat, which is just really cool to me, they will actually clamp down on the shell, and then they'll take their tongue and slam it down from the roof of their mouth to the bottom of their mouth so fast that this creates suction that pulls the meat of the mollusk out. So they're very highly adapted to this mollusk eating diet. Although you occasionally get just a few walruses out of a population where there's a lot of overlap with seal populations, and sometimes some of the big bull male walruses will start eating seals, and they are actually actively predating on these seals. And the paper that I read about this said that they were actually pinning the seals down and then like sucking the flesh off of them, which is really morbid, but also kind of interesting because pinnipeds just don't really like to follow rules. It seems to be one of their greatest characters. So this is sort of where we are in the modern world, but like all animals, pinnipeds have a history that reaches back in time. So they are carnivores. So just like lions or bears or civets, or what have you, they are all mammalian carnivores, but they are on the dog side of the tree. So in carnivorans and mammals, you've got the cat side, so things like lions and civets, and then on the other side, you have your caniforms, so your dog-like things, your bears, and your pinnipeds. And then pinnipeds they share a common ancestor with the two other groups of arctoids. So those are bears and mustelids, so little weaselly things. And then also in there are raccoons and red pandas. But zooming in on the pinniped part of our carnivoran tree, we've got our three living living families, our true seals, our walruses, and our eared seals. But we also have several notable extinct groups. And the earliest pinnipeds that we have are Potamotherium and Puhila. So we'll take a quick look at those. So both of these creatures are relatively otter-like. They were found in environments that preserve geological environments that are preserving river or estuary habitats. So they look a lot more ottery than our pinnipeds look today. So probably more similar to that last common ancestor of your bears, your weaselly things, and your pinnipeds. And one thing that's specifically interesting to me about these organisms is that they have this long tail. And that's something that we see get reduced as we move down the pinniped tree. Yes. Yeah, and Puhila was actually found off the coast of Alaska. So a lot of the pinniped evolutionary story happens in the North Pacific, and we have a ton of these pinniped fossils from Oregon, which is another reason why I was specifically interested in studying them. So then as you start to get more derived, more adapted for the marine environment, we see sort of the next group of pinnipeds arise, the Enaliarctine. So this is a number of more pinnipedish pinnipeds. So we're getting closer and closer to what we know today as we go up the tree. So this is the fossil of Enaliarctos mielzi. This was a fossil that was found on the Oregon coast. You can see that in this picture down to the left, we're starting to get a more typical pinniped body form. So we've the limbs have gone from sort of otter-like paws to actual flippers. We also get this great reduction in tail length, and we also get an increase in body size. And something that's kind of interesting about the change in tail length, this is sort of, there's always interesting things going on with tails when organisms move from the land back into the sea. So with whales, for instance, you see this great expansion of the tail for locomotion. But in pinnipeds, they really shortened their tails and have sort of focused their swimming in their limbs, which makes them different from whales and sirenians. And you also see this tail shortening, interestingly enough, happening in fishing cats, which are these cute little spotted cats that, unlike my cats, actually really enjoy being in the water and doing a lot of fishing. So it's sort of interesting that there's this similar pattern happening here. And then, so at the same time that we have sort of these early pinnipeds, so on this phylogeny here, the green signifies the time in which we actually have fossils for those groups. So sort of early in pinniped history, we have these sort of the Enaliarctines that are coexisting with our earliest members of the groups that we know today. So walruses appear between 25 and 20 million years ago during the Miocene off the coast of Oregon, interestingly enough. And we also see the other group of sort of crown or derived pinnipeds arise at this time, the desmatophocids, which is really where I sort of come into this story, or where I've like really gotten interested in this story. So desmatophocids are some of the earliest large-bodied pinnipeds that we see, and they inhabited the North Pacific Ocean. We have fossils from them along the west coast of North America, as well as Japan. And these organisms lived from about 24 to 9 million years ago. And they are more closely related to eared seals and walruses than they are to true seals. So I really got interested in this group because my very first year of graduate school, my very first term, I was assigned the fossil that you see here in my vertebrate paleontology class as part of a project to identify fossils from the collection. And as I studied this fossil, I got to do some of the actual fossil prep work on it, which was really fun. I was comparing it to other known desmatophocids, and it really started to seem more and more as though this specimen represented a species that was previously unidentified. So here you can see some pictures of it. Something that makes this specimen notable is that it has a combination of characteristics that are more like the sort of more advanced desmatophocids, as well as some features that make it more similar to those early Enaliarctines. So in the course of studying this fossil, running a phylogenetic analysis, myself and my co-authors determined that this was the sort of the earliest diverging desmatophocid. And what really makes, and yes, I drew this nice little picture of it to try to represent what it might have looked like. And one thing that's really interesting, two main things to me that are really interesting about this species, which I named Eodesmus condoni after Thomas Condon, who many of you have probably heard of. He was the first paleontologist at University of Oregon and also discovered the first desmatophocid. But the two really interesting things about this specimen to me is that it comes from a horizon on the Oregon coast, of the Astoria Formation. So if you've ever been out to Beverly Beach State Park or Moolock Beach, it's right in there where this specimen was originally found. And that horizon, known as the Iron Mountain Bed, has produced about 5 other species of pinniped that we know of, including the earliest walruses, some enaliarctines, as well as other desmatophocid species. So as early as 17 million years ago, we already had a very diverse fauna of pinnipeds living off the Oregon coast. So today, off the Oregon coast, you'll see harbor seals, California sea lions, stellar sea lions, occasionally elephant seals and northern fur seals. So it's interesting to me that we already, even 17 million years ago, we already had a very diverse group of pinnipeds living off the Oregon coast, which makes this a wonderful state to live in because it has a great history of pinnipeds stretching back for a really long time. And another thing that is really, really interesting about this specimen is that it represents the earliest earliest pinniped that we know of that used a raptorial feeding style. And what I mean by raptorial feeding style is that it's not using its forelimbs, it's not using its front limbs to help it eat. It is simply going in with its head and just biting things and snatching them up and using what is known as grab and gulp feeding. So there's no chewing, there's no real processing of the food. There's just like maybe a little bit of tearing from just whipping its head around and then swallowing. So before this, the enaliarctines, even some of these really early walruses, still have teeth that probably allowed for some chewing, some food processing. But this is the first time that we really see this raptorial feeding style arise. So this kind of got me thinking about, so if we've got this sort of switch in dietary ecology, and I wondered what else might have been changing with the rise of these early ground pinnipeds, which got me wondering about their locomotor evolution. So going back to our pinniped tree, I wanted to sort of look at the way that these different groups were swimming to try to reconstruct the way that these different swimming modes arose. So true seals, like I mentioned before, are primarily hind limb propelled. So they swim using a lateral oscillation of their hind limbs. So whales kind of swim like this with their hind limbs, and seals, weirdly enough, swim sort of sideways. So it's a little more similar to, slightly more similar to the way that, say, a shark or a tuna would swim, although it's still pretty different, but it's very unusual for mammals. And then your eared seals, your sea lions, your fur seals, they are forelimb propelled, and they swim using this mode of swimming kind of known as underwater flying. So it's more similar to the way that a penguin swims, and is also kind of unusual for mammals because other marine mammals are very hind propelled. And then, of course, this leaves us with walruses. And walruses, unsurprisingly, the rest of them is weird. So their way of swimming is weird too. At slow speeds, as they're sort of cruising along the bottom of the seabed, snuffling around for bivalves down in the mud, they're going to be using their forelimbs for swimming. But when they switch to high speed swimming, and they can actually go pretty fast, which is, again, kind of surprising to me. But they then switch to using their hind limbs, as you can see from this little video clip here. And the thing that makes this kind of strange is that walruses are more closely to eared seals than they are to true seals, but they have a mode of swimming that seems more similar to the true seals. And the thing that makes this tricky to figure out is that modern walruses are really specialized for this very specific niche. So you can see here this picture of a walrus skull. It's really boxy. It's got these huge tusks and all of this sort of morphological accommodation for these giant tusks. But if you look back, so we only have this one species of walrus that still exists today. But walruses have a deep fossil history stretching back about 20 million years. And these old species of walruses that aren't around anymore actually look really, really vastly different from our super derived modern walrus. So this is the skull of Proneotherium, which is one of the earliest walruses known. And it also came from the same horizon as Eodesmus condoni. But you can see this one's it doesn't have the giant tusks. Its mouth structure is not specialized for suction feeding. Its teeth are much more similar to Eodesmus. There maybe was the beginning of this raptorial feeding style at this stage as well on this other part of that side of the pinniped tree. But it just it's interesting. It's kind of like, where exactly did this odd style of walrus swimming begin? What exactly might have been driving this evolution? And how do we figure it out? Because if we want to know how a harbor seal swims, we can go to the zoo or to the ocean and just watch how it swims. But if you want to know how a walrus that lived 17 million years ago swam, it'd be really nice if we could just hop in our time machine. But the physics department hasn't figured that out yet. So we're sort of lost. We're sort of left with this question of how we go about figuring out the swimming modes of these fossil pinnipeds that are only represented by fossils. And you might find the solution to this problem rather humorous. And that is because there is a ton of information, evolutionary and locomotor, contained in the humeri of mammals. So the humerus is the upper bone of the arm. You have one, your pets have one, unless you have fish, I guess. Fish would not have humeri. But humeri are incredibly, they're often very, very adapted to the purpose that it's sort of serving. So for instance, in the upper left-hand corner here, you can see a human humerus. Ours are fairly strange because we're bipeds. But then it gets even stranger. So in the middle here is a mole humerus. It's very specialized for digging. On the far right is a whale humerus. So whales, their forelimbs are very stiffened by cartilage, and so you don't even have as much interlocking of the bones as you do in other animals. So we have all of this information that's sort of contained in the shape of the humerus about what an organism is doing with that humerus. So to sort of try to unlock the mysteries of pinniped locomotion using humerus shape, I first digitized the shapes of a bunch of different modern pinniped humeri. So true seals with their hind limb swimming mode, eared seals with their forelimb swimming mode, and walruses with the sort of intermediate mode, using this device called a microscribe. So this arm rotates in three-dimensional space and digitizes points where you click on it. So it essentially takes the shape of something that exists in real space and then turns that into coordinates. So sort of if you're thinking about like your algebra Cartesian plane, but in three-dimensional space. So it's literally recording an X, Y, and Z coordinate. And then you can take this information, take the three-dimensional shape of these different humeri from different categories and run them through a discriminant function analysis. And then you sort of built a model that you can use the shape of digitized shape of fossil humeri to essentially diagnose what swimming mode that fossil pinniped was using. So using this method, after collecting data at the Smithsonian, I found some pretty interesting patterns. So these are the specimens that I digitized from the Smithsonian. So up here at the top, you'll recognize Potamotherium. So that was that long tail early pinniped. Pinarctidion was an Enaliarctine, another one of those early pinnipeds. And then here you see your desmatophocids, and then the last three are walruses. And interestingly, my analysis returned all of the desmatophocids and fossil walruses as four-limb swimmers, which I was somewhat surprised by, because I was expecting that these I was kind of expecting for these walruses to perhaps be hind limb propelled. So essentially what this indicates, if we look back at our big pinniped tree, is that the ancestral condition for the family, so the ancestor of all of our pinnipeds that we know today, was swimming with its hind limbs, kind of like true seals today. And then as we move towards the walruses and eared seals, their last common ancestor would have been a four-limb swimmer, was sort of a switch back to that ancestral condition in our modern walruses. But this is this intermediate swimming mode that we see with modern walruses that's primarily hind limb at speed, is from this model expected to be a relatively recent development. And my sort of hypothesis that I'm going to be exploring in my future research is that this is specifically tied to differences in feeding mode. So your true seals, many of them actually still use their forelimbs to grasp prey, for sort of manipulating their prey, for biting and tearing. They're still using those forelimbs for prey manipulation, and so it's better for them to have those hind limbs freed up for locomotion so that they can use their forelimbs for prey manipulation. But with the appearance of this raptorial feeding style, you no longer need your forelimbs for prey manipulation. And so I think this is just a fascinating picture of a sea lion taking a big old bite out of a sunfish. But you can see there's no real forelimb involvement in the feeding process. And it's helpful from a physics perspective to move your propulsion closer to your head so that you can better sort of move more quickly to catch these like super fast moving fish. And then you see this other switch with walruses that sort of appears alongside this molluscivore. So finally, continuing to think about walruses, we're in the midst of some very serious anthropogenic climate change. And all of the current data, as well as the forecasting, is indicating that the Arctic is warming faster than anywhere else. And of course, walruses are one of the species that lives in this region, and they rely on ice to haul out, to rest. Often mothers will haul out with their babies onto the ice. So there's sort of this real concern about walruses going extinct in the next few hundred years, even though their population is fairly stable now. Their environment is going to be vastly changing. So this kind of phenomenon, after watching some documentaries, got me wondering about sort of how are walruses doomed? And a couple of things made me wonder if maybe they're not doomed. And there are two sort of big things. So I got the original idea for doing this project this summer when I was seeing in the European news the story about this walrus named Wally, who had shown up off the coast of Ireland and England and Spain, which is thousands of kilometers outside of walrus's normal range. And Wally seems to be doing great. And he's just one walrus, so this area wasn't supporting a large population, but he was healthy. He was very fat and still eating plenty of food. And I thought it was very interesting that this walrus was way outside of his range and seeming to do just fine. And the other thing that really got me wondering about this was looking at the distribution of walrus fossils. So our modern mollusk-eating walrus that now lives just within the Arctic Circle has a pretty extensive fossil record going back for a couple 100,000 years. And these fossils are distributed way further south than they are today. So we have walrus fossils from as far south as Georgia, actually, and we've also found walrus fossils in the harbor of San Francisco. And this is actually way further south than the ice sheets during the ice ages ever extended. So we have this idea that walruses sort of rely on sea ice, and animals' realized ecology, so where it actually lives, doesn't always match what it can actually live within. So just because walruses today are tied to sea ice, we don't necessarily know that this is how it's always been. And therefore, we don't know that that's how it always will be. So I had an idea to use the fossil occurrences of walruses, which are here indicated in green, to model the response of walruses to upcoming climate change and compare that to the results of modeling from using only modern walrus occurrence data. So to do that, I used an ecological niche modeling process that I'm running out of time, so I won't spend too much time on it. But you can essentially use the occurrence data, so the latitude and longitude of a species, and combine that with environmental data for an area. So here you can, these little pink dots sort of represent occurrences. And then each of these layers represents a different set of environmental variables like temperature, rainfall, or elevation. And then you can sort of suck up these the information for each of these occurrence points to build a model that shows you sort of where in this environmental parameter space an organism lives. And then you can use that to model their predicted habitable range, so the area where they could live according to these environmental parameters. So using this method, so ignore the Antarctic, we don't have walruses down there, but I'm still working out a few bugs in my code. So this is the modeled range of modern walruses. So this is sort of where modern walruses could live. So they don't live all of these places anymore, but some of the areas like the Bay of St. Lawrence, as well as the Okhotsk Sea north of Japan. There were once walruses there, but they've been extirpated in modern history. And this is the range of walruses using the fossil data set, so 21,000 years ago. And so if we take this modern, the previous model, this modern model, and forecast it to the year 2100 using current projections for climate, this is our expected range for walruses in the year 2100. So not great. I actually thought my code was broken when it first generated, when R first generated this map. But you can see there's just a little bit of a sort of an area where they could potentially live south of Scandinavia. So pretty much blank. But if you use the fossil data to build the model to project walrus occurrence, the picture is a little less horrific. We've got some specific areas that could potentially be targets for conservation in the Hudson Bay, as well as in the Northwestern Territories of Canada and the Laptev Sea up here north of Siberia. So this sort of says to us for when we are thinking about conservation, not just to look at the modern distribution of organisms, but also to pay attention to their fossil distribution as well. So in conclusion, our pinnipeds are marine amphibious mammals that occupy a whole bunch of different environments with a rich evolutionary history that stretches back for 25 million years. And this swimming style of pinnipeds that we have been looking at most likely co-evolved with their different feeding styles. And finally, that the current range of walruses that we see with our modern walrus populations does not encompass the entire possibility of places where they could live. And so climate change is likely to have a surprising impact on their ecology. And with that, I conclude my talk. Thank you all so much for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions now.